The machines screamed, flatlined, died. Alexandra Sterling's body convulsed on the hospital bed as America's finest doctors stepped back in defeat. The billionaire CEO's rare autoimmune syndrome had crushed every treatment. Experimental drugs from Switzerland, plasma exchanges, cutting-edge immunotherapy. Nothing worked. Her immune system was killing her from the inside, and the medical world's brightest minds could only watch. Outside in the sterile hallway, Brennan pushed his janitor's cart past the chaos, his calloused hands steady despite the tremor that never left since Iraq. When he heard type AB negative with specific antibodies, something cold gripped his chest. The blood donor card in his wallet felt like it was burning. Everyone had failed to save her. But Cole's scarred veins carried something no doctor understood, something forged in the chemical fires of war that might be her only salvation. Cole's fingers traced the worn edges of his donor card through the fabric of his work pants. The plastic was soft from years of carrying, corners rounded from countless anxious touches during sleepless nights when the memories came crawling back. Type AB negative with rare antibodies, words that had haunted him since his discharge from the 82nd Airborne Division. The doctors at Walter Reed had called it Gulf War Syndrome, a genetic mutation caused by chemical exposure in Fallujah. They'd monitored him for years, taking samples, running tests, their clinical fascination masking something deeper. Now, standing in this sterile corridor, while a woman died 20 feet away, Cole finally understood why his blood mattered. Dr. Reynolds burst through the ICU doors like a man fleeing demons, his surgical mask hanging loose around his neck. Sweat-carved tributaries through the exhaustion etched on his face as he addressed the cluster of specialists huddled near the nurses' station. "We've lost her twice in the last hour," he announced, his voice cracking like old leather left too long in the sun. "The experimental alemtuzumab isn't working. Her autoimmune response is too aggressive, too fast." He pulled off his gloves with violent jerks. "Unless we find a donor with the exact antibody profile to match her genetic markers, she has maybe 6 hours left." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the rhythmic beeping of life support machines and the soft squeak of Cole's cartwheels against polished linoleum. Cole stopped mopping. His reflection stared back from the polished floor. A 38-year-old man in navy blue scrubs, weathered by war and single parenthood, like driftwood shaped by relentless tides. The donor card trembled in his grip as memories of Lucas flickered through his mind like old home movies. His 8-year-old son was asleep in their double-wide trailer right now, homework spread across the tiny kitchen table like fallen leaves, trusting his father to come home every morning with stories of empty hallways and quiet nights. Cole had never been a hero, just a survivor carrying the ghosts of dead soldiers and the weight of impossible bills. But the card in his wallet suggested a different story entirely. "Excuse me." Cole's voice cut through the medical conference like a blade through silk. Dr. Reynolds turned, his tired eyes focusing on the janitor with the slow recognition of someone pulling themselves back from the edge of despair. "I couldn't help but overhear. You need type AB negative with specific antibodies?" Cole pulled out his card, the plastic worn smooth from years of nervous handling. "I'm AB negative. Gulf War Syndrome gave me some kind of unusual blood chemistry." The words felt strange in his mouth, a secret he'd carried alone for 15 years, suddenly spoken aloud. "The doctors at Walter Reed said my antibodies were unlike anything they'd documented." Dr. Reynolds snatched the card with trembling fingers, his eyes scanning the medical codes printed in small black letters. The other doctors crowded around him like pilgrims studying a holy relic, their exhausted faces transforming with something that might have been hope. "This is it," Dr. Reynolds whispered, his voice thick with disbelief. "The exact markers we need. Mr. Brennan, would you be willing to donate blood? We're talking about an immediate transfusion, possibly multiple units. Cole thought of Lucas sleeping peacefully in their trailer, unaware that his father was about to step into something that would change everything. "Yes," he said simply. "Whatever she needs." 20 minutes later, Cole lay on a gurney beside Alexandra Sterling's bed, watching his blood flow through clear tubing into the woman who commanded boardrooms and graced magazine covers. The irony wasn't lost on him. A minimum-wage janitor literally giving his life force to save a billionaire CEO. Alexandra's face was pale as winter moonlight, her breathing shallow and labored like someone drowning in slow motion. Dark circles shadowed her eyes, and her famous golden hair lay matted against the pillow like seaweed washed ashore. This was not the commanding executive whose hostile takeovers made headlines, but a woman stripped down to her most vulnerable essence. Mortal, fragile, dying. Cole watched the monitors, counting heartbeats like rosary beads. The change began within minutes, subtle at first, like dawn creeping across a darkened landscape. Alexandra's breathing deepened, color creeping back into her cheeks like watercolor bleeding across wet paper. The frantic beeping of the monitors settled into steadier rhythms, and the tension that had gripped the ICU began to ease like a held breath finally released. Dr. Reynolds stared at the readouts in amazement, then at Cole, then back at the numbers that defied every medical textbook he'd studied in 30 years of practice. "This is impossible," he whispered, his voice filled with the awe of someone witnessing a miracle. "Her inflammatory markers are dropping faster than anything I've ever seen. The autoimmune response is actually stopping." Cole felt something shift in his chest, a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying for 15 years, finally beginning to lift. 6 hours later, Alexandra Sterling opened her eyes for the first time in 3 days. The ICU was quiet except for the soft hum of equipment and the distant murmur of hospital life continuing beyond these walls. Cole sat in the visitor's chair, his arm bandaged from the transfusion, watching her with the careful attention of someone accustomed to night watches and unexpected dangers. When their eyes met across the narrow space between gurney and chair, something passed between them. Recognition, gratitude, and something deeper that neither could name or explain. "You saved my life," she said, her voice hoarse from the ventilator tube, but stronger than anyone had expected. Cole shifted uncomfortably in the plastic chair, unused to being the center of anyone's universe, especially someone whose net worth exceeded the GDP of small countries. "Just happened to have the right blood type," Cole replied, his words carrying the weight of a man who'd learned to deflect praise like bullets. Alexandra studied his face with the intensity she usually reserved for quarterly reports and hostile negotiations. The network of lines around his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights, the careful way he held himself like someone expecting attack, the faded scar along his jawline that whispered of violence survived. "Dr. Reynolds said your blood contains antibodies they've never documented before. Something about chemical exposure during military service." Her business mind was already cataloging information, seeking patterns and connections with the relentless efficiency that had built her empire. Cole nodded slowly, memories of burning skies and choking smoke flickering behind his eyes like frames from a damaged film reel. "Fallujah, 2004. Chemical weapons depot went up when our convoy hit an IED." Cole's words were clipped, economical, the way soldiers learned to speak about the unspeakable things they'd witnessed and survived. "Most of my unit didn't make it out. The exposure should have killed me too." He paused, his hands unconsciously rubbing the scars on his forearms where shrapnel had torn through flesh and muscle. "Instead, it changed my blood chemistry somehow, made it unusual according to the docs at Walter Reed." He pulled out his phone with movements that spoke of long practice, showing her a photo of Lucas grinning, gap-toothed at the camera, his school uniform slightly rumpled, backpack sliding off one shoulder. My son inherited some of the same markers. The doctors monitor us both every 6 months. Alexandra stared at the photo with an expression Cole couldn't quite read. Something softened in her features as she looked at the boy's innocent smile, the trust and joy radiating from his 8-year-old face. "He's beautiful," she said quietly, and Cole heard genuine warmth in her voice for the first time. "What's his name?" The question was simple, but the way she asked it suggested she actually cared about the answer, not just making polite conversation with the man who'd saved her life. "Lucas," Cole replied, his voice automatically gentling the way it always did when he talked about his son. "He's 8, smart as hell and twice as stubborn." Alexandra smiled then, a real smile that transformed her entire face, and Cole glimpsed the woman underneath the corporate armor. "Sounds like someone I know," she said, and something in her tone suggested she might be talking about herself. The hospital discharged Alexandra 3 days later with a pharmaceutical arsenal and strict instructions for follow-up care. Cole returned to his night shift, pushing the same cart through the same corridors, but everything felt different now. The weight of saving a life had settled into his bones like arthritis, aching and unfamiliar, but somehow necessary. His trailer felt smaller when he came home that Thursday morning, Lucas already dressed for school and bouncing on his toes by the front door. "Dad, you smell like hospital," Lucas announced, his 8-year-old nose wrinkling with the brutal honesty that only children possessed. "Did someone get hurt?" Cole knelt down to tie his son's shoes, searching for words that wouldn't frighten a child who'd already lost too much. "Just had to help someone who was very sick, buddy. Like when you share your lunch with kids who forget theirs." Lucas nodded solemnly, accepting this explanation with the easy faith of childhood, but his dark eyes studied his father's face with unsettling perception. "Are they better now?" he asked, and Cole thought of Alexandra's eyes opening in the ICU, the color returning to her face like spring after a hard winter, the monitors singing their electronic songs of life restored and death postponed. "Yeah, kiddo, they're better now." But as Lucas climbed onto the school bus with his oversized backpack and gap-toothed grin, Cole wondered if saving Alexandra Sterling had somehow changed him too, if the act of giving life had awakened something in him that had been sleeping since Jennifer left. The thought followed him into his empty trailer like a stray dog, persistent and unwelcome. The envelope arrived the following Tuesday, delivered by a courier in a black suit who looked like he'd stepped out of a government thriller or a very expensive funeral. Inside was a cashier's check for $10,000 and a business card with only a phone number printed in elegant script. Cole stared at the check until the numbers blurred. More money than he'd seen since his discharge from the army 5 years ago. His hands shook as he dialed the number with fingers that suddenly felt too large for the buttons, Lucas's voice echoing from the kitchen where he was struggling through multiplication tables that might as well have been hieroglyphics. "Mr. Brennan?" The voice was crisp, professional, unmistakably Alexandra's, despite the distortion of the phone line. "I'd like to meet with you, about your blood, and what it might mean for other people." They met at Rosie's Diner on the outskirts of Springfield, far from the corporate towers and society pages where Alexandra Sterling usually appeared like a visiting dignitary from another planet. She sat in a corner booth with cracked vinyl seats, wearing jeans and a simple blue sweater that probably cost more than Cole's monthly rent, but looked like something any suburban mother might wear to a PTA meeting. Without the makeup and designer armor, she looked younger, more human, like someone Cole might have known in another life before war and divorce and the grinding reality of single parenthood had worn him down to his essential elements. "I've been researching your condition since I got out of the hospital," she said without preamble, sliding a thick folder across the table's scarred surface. Gulf War syndrome, chemical exposure, genetic adaptation. Your blood doesn't just treat autoimmune diseases, Cole. It might prevent them entirely. Cole wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, feeling the warmth seep through the ceramic like a small blessing. The diner smelled of bacon grease and broken dreams, the kind of place where truck drivers and night shift workers came to carb load before facing another day in jobs that paid just enough to keep them coming back. "What exactly are you saying?" he asked, though part of him already knew where this conversation was heading. Alexandra leaned forward, her eyes bright with the intensity that had built her empire from nothing but determination and borrowed money. "I'm saying your sacrifice in Iraq created something that could save millions of lives. Children with lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, type 1 diabetes. Your genetic mutation could help them all." She tapped the folder with manicured fingernails that had probably never been dirty in their lives. "I want to fund the research. Full study, complete safeguards for Lucas, compensation for your time and participation." The number that came next hit Cole like a physical blow, knocking the air from his lungs and making his vision swim slightly. $10,000 a month during the research phase was more than he made in a year of mopping floors and emptying trash cans, more than he'd ever imagined having at one time. Lucas could have the inhaler he needed without Cole having to choose between medication and groceries, new clothes that actually fit instead of hand-me-downs from the church donation box, maybe even college someday instead of the military or trade school. But something in Alexandra's expression made him hesitate, a vulnerability that flickered across her features like candlelight in a drafty room. "What's the catch?" he asked, because in his experience, nothing good ever came without a price that wasn't immediately obvious. "There's no catch," Alexandra replied, but then her smile faltered slightly. "Except I might need periodic transfusions. The antibodies don't last forever in my system. We'd be medically connected for the foreseeable future." The research facility was housed in a converted warehouse on the industrial side of Springfield, nothing like the gleaming laboratories Cole had imagined from watching medical dramas on television. Dr. Reynolds and a small team of specialists worked with equipment that looked more functional than impressive, their enthusiasm making up for what they lacked in resources and funding. "Mr. Brennan, what we're seeing in your blood work is absolutely unprecedented," Dr. Reynolds explained as he showed Cole through the lab, pointing to microscopes and centrifuges and machines whose purposes Cole could only guess at. "Your antibodies don't just treat autoimmune conditions like traditional medicine. They actually seem to teach the patient's immune system how to regulate itself, how to distinguish between threats and normal tissue." The doctor's excitement was infectious, but Cole found himself thinking about Lucas, wondering what price his son might pay for carrying this genetic gift. Lucas visited the lab every Saturday morning, his 8-year-old mind absorbing scientific concepts with the easy brilliance of childhood, asking questions that made the researchers pause and think, and sometimes scramble for textbooks. He moved through the facility like he belonged there, chatting with lab technicians and peering into microscopes with the fearless curiosity that adults envied but rarely possessed. "So my blood is like medicine for other kids?" he asked Dr. Reynolds during one visit, his small hands carefully holding a test tube filled with his own plasma. "More like a teacher," the doctor replied, kneeling down to Lucas's eye level. "It shows other people's blood how to be healthy again." Lucas nodded seriously, processing this information with the gravity he brought to all important matters, then turned to Cole with eyes that held too much understanding for someone so young. "Dad, we're going to help a lot of sick kids, aren't we?" The question carried the weight of destiny, and Cole felt something shift in his chest like tectonic plates finding new alignment. "Yeah, buddy," he said quietly, ruffling his son's dark hair. "I think we are." But even as he spoke the words, Cole couldn't shake the feeling that they were stepping into something larger than themselves, something that would demand more than blood samples and monthly checkups. The future stretched ahead like an unmarked road, and Cole had learned in Iraq that unmarked roads often led to places you never intended to go. Still, watching Lucas's face light up with the possibility of helping other children, Cole knew they were already too far down this path to turn back, even if he'd wanted to. The first news report aired on a Thursday evening during the dinner hour when most of Springfield was settling down to meatloaf and mashed potatoes. Billionaire CEO saved by hospital janitor's miracle blood. The anchor announced, with the practiced drama of someone paid to make everything sound urgent and life-changing. Cole watched from his trailer's tiny living room, Lucas curled up beside him on the second-hand couch they'd bought from a church rummage sale, both of them staring at Alexandra's professional headshot filling the television screen like some kind of corporate saint. "That's the lady you helped," Lucas said matter-of-factly, pointing at the screen with a chicken nugget. "She's really pretty. Do you think she's nice?" Cole reached for the remote, but the damage was already done. By the next morning, reporters would be camped outside the Shady Oaks trailer park like an occupying army. "Mr. Brennan, can you tell us about your blood?" The questions came like machine gun fire as Cole tried to walk Lucas to the school bus the next morning, cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward like weapons of mass curiosity. Lucas pressed closer to his father's side, his small hand gripping Cole's with desperate strength, his usual chatter silenced by the chaos surrounding them. "Is it true you're some kind of medical miracle?" A reporter shouted over the crowd, her bleached smile sharp as broken glass. "How does it feel to save a billionaire's life?" Cole wrapped his arm around his son and pushed through the crowd, his military training taking over, creating a protective corridor through the mob of journalists and cameramen. "No comment," he said firmly. But the vultures had smelled blood in the water, and Cole knew this was only the beginning. Alexandra called that evening while Cole was helping Lucas with homework, her voice tight with guilt and something that might have been fear. "I'm so sorry, Cole. I never intended for this to become a media circus." He could hear the strain in her words, the weight of unintended consequences settling on her shoulders like lead blankets. "My board is concerned about the media attention. They think it makes the company look unstable, like I'm not focused on business." She paused, and in that silence, Cole heard the real message hiding underneath the corporate speak. "You're going to distance yourself from this," he said, not making it a question because he'd heard this song before when things got complicated. "From the research, from me." The silence stretched between them like a chasm, filled with everything they couldn't say, and everything they both understood about the way the world really worked. But Alexandra surprised him, her voice coming back stronger than before, filled with the steel that had built her empire from nothing. "No," she said firmly, the word carrying the weight of a declaration of war. "I'm going to fight for this research, for you and Lucas and every child who could benefit from what we're doing here." The conviction in her voice was like hearing someone find their true purpose after years of wandering in the wilderness. "I've scheduled an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. I'm going to propose a formal partnership between Sterling Industries and the Research Foundation. Full funding, complete transparency, and protection for your family." Cole felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with the woman whose life he'd saved and who was now trying to save his in return. The board meeting was a war zone disguised as corporate civility, fought with quarterly reports instead of bullets and stock prices instead of artillery. Cole sat in the back of the Sterling Industries conference room, feeling like an imposter in his borrowed suit, watching Alexandra battle for something he'd never dared to hope for. The other board members looked like they'd been cast from the same expensive mold, silver-haired men in $1,000 suits, and women with faces that spoke of good breeding and better investments. "This research represents the future of autoimmune treatment," Alexandra told the assembled executives, her voice carrying the authority of someone born to command boardrooms and bend corporations to her will. The potential market value is in the hundreds of billions. We're talking about curing diseases that affect millions of people worldwide. Alexandra, this media circus is affecting our stock price. Chairman Rothschild interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of old money and older prejudices. His disapproval filled the room like expensive cologne, cloying and inescapable. Investors are concerned about your judgment, about your apparent obsession with this situation. The pause before situation carried volumes of meaning, none of it flattering. Your association with this man raises serious questions about your focus and your ability to lead this company effectively. The words hung in the air like poison gas, and Cole started to stand, ready to leave before he caused Alexandra any more damage. But her voice stopped him cold, cutting through the corporate bullshit like a blade through silk. "This man saved my life," Alexandra said, her words ringing through the conference room with the clarity of church bells. "If this board has a problem with that fact, if you're more concerned about stock prices than the revolutionary medical breakthrough sitting in our lap, then perhaps it's time to reconsider my position here." The silence that followed was deafening, filled with the sound of jaws dropping and career calculations being rapidly recalculated. Alexandra Sterling had just threatened to walk away from the empire she'd built from nothing, the company that bore her name and carried her legacy, for a janitor and his 8-year-old son. Cole felt something break open in his chest, a door he'd kept locked since Jennifer left him for being broken and difficult and not quite enough. Alexandra met his eyes across the conference room, and in that moment he understood that saving her life had somehow begun to save his own. The vote was closer than it should have been, 7-5 in favor of the research partnership, with abstentions from board members who were probably already updating their resumes. As the executives filed out, muttering among themselves about liability and public relations nightmares and the unpredictable nature of near-death experiences, Alexandra remained seated at the head of the polished mahogany table that had probably cost more than Cole's annual salary. Cole approached slowly, still processing what had just happened, still trying to understand how his life had become something out of a medical drama. "You risked everything," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood the true cost of sacrifice. "Your company, your reputation, your legacy. For me. For Lucas." Alexandra looked up at him, exhaustion and triumph warring in her expression like armies fighting for the same piece of contested ground. "Some things are worth the risk," she replied, and Cole heard something in her voice that hadn't been there before, a certainty, a peace that came from finally knowing what mattered most. "Besides, I learned something from nearly dying in that hospital bed. Money and power mean nothing if you're alone when you need them most." She stood up slowly, her movements careful but determined, and Cole noticed that her hands weren't shaking anymore. "I spent 20 years building an empire that impressed everyone and satisfied no one, especially me. Maybe it's time to build something that actually matters." The words hung between them like a bridge, and Cole felt himself taking the first tentative steps across it, towards something he'd never allowed himself to want, but couldn't bring himself to refuse. 3 months into the research partnership, Cole and Alexandra fell into an unexpected rhythm that surprised them both with its naturalness. He would arrive at the lab after his night shift at the hospital, Lucas in tow on weekends and school holidays, and they would review progress reports over coffee that tasted like it had been brewing since the Clinton administration. Alexandra shed her corporate armor in those quiet moments, revealing glimpses of the woman underneath, someone who collected vintage mystery novels, who could debug computer code with the same skill she'd once used to dismantle competitors, who listened to Lucas's endless questions about blood cells and antibodies with genuine fascination rather than polite tolerance. Cole found himself looking forward to these meetings in ways that had nothing to do with the $10,000 being deposited in his bank account every month. "Tell me about your ex-wife," Alexandra said one Saturday morning, as they watched Lucas and Dr. Reynolds conduct what they called an experiment, but looked suspiciously like an 8-year-old playing with very expensive laboratory equipment. The question came out of nowhere, delivered with the casual directness that characterized everything about Alexandra Sterling, as if she'd been thinking about it for weeks and had finally decided to voice her curiosity. Cole's hand stilled on his coffee cup, memories rising like smoke from a fire he'd thought was finally extinguished. "Jennifer. She left when Lucas was 5, about a year after I got back from my 3rd deployment." He paused, old wounds aching like arthritis in cold weather. "Said she couldn't handle the PTSD, the financial stress, the uncertainty of being married to someone who woke up screaming 3 nights a week." Alexandra's jaw tightened, almost imperceptibly, a muscle jumping beneath her skin like a small, angry animal. "That must have been incredibly difficult," she said, and Cole heard genuine sympathy in her voice rather than the polite concern most people offered when they asked about personal tragedies they didn't really want to understand. "It was," Cole admitted, surprised by how easy it was to talk to her about things he'd never discussed with anyone except his VA counselor. But honestly, the worst part wasn't her leaving. It was her parting shot as she packed her bags. He looked over at Lucas, who was explaining something to Dr. Reynolds with animated hand gestures and the supreme confidence of childhood. "She said Lucas was going to grow up damaged because of my weird blood and my problems. Called him a freak who would never fit in anywhere." The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees, and when Cole looked back at Alexandra, her eyes had gone cold as winter ice. "She was wrong," Alexandra said flatly, her voice carrying the absolute certainty of someone stating mathematical facts. "Lucas is extraordinary, brilliant, compassionate, curious about everything. Any parent would be lucky to have him." The words were delivered without drama or false comfort, just simple truth spoken with conviction. Cole felt something warm unfurl in his chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced since before Jennifer left, the sensation of someone seeing his son clearly and loving what they saw. "What about you?" he asked, deflecting attention from emotions that felt too large for the small lab space. "Ever been married? Kids?" Alexandra shook her head, her expression growing distant as she stared out the window at the Springfield skyline. "Came close to marriage once, about 5 years ago. Turned out he was more interested in my bank account than my company." She smiled wryly, but Cole could see the hurt that still lingered around the edges of her carefully composed features. "I learned to keep my heart and my business separate after that. Built walls so high that most people couldn't climb them, even if they wanted to try." She turned back to him, and something vulnerable flickered in her eyes before she could hide it behind her usual composure. "Safer that way. Less complicated. Less potential for devastation when things inevitably fall apart." The breakthrough came on a Tuesday in October, when the leaves were turning colors that reminded Cole of the sunsets he'd watched from guard towers in Iraq. Dr. Reynolds burst into the lab's makeshift break room, where Cole and Alexandra were reviewing funding reports and arguing good-naturedly about the merits of various coffee brands. "We did it," he announced, his usually composed demeanor cracking with excitement, like ice breaking up on a river in spring. "Synthetic antibodies that mimic Cole's natural immunity, 94% effective in laboratory trials." He thrust a tablet into Alexandra's hands, the screen filled with charts and graphs that meant everything to the medical team and nothing to Cole beyond the obvious fact that they represented some kind of victory. Cole felt something twist in his stomach, an emotion he couldn't quite name, but didn't like the taste of. Success in creating synthetic antibodies meant freedom from the medical dependency that had bound him and Alexandra together for months, freedom from the regular transfusions and blood draws that had become as routine as Lucas's bedtime stories. It also meant freedom from the connection that had grown between them, the excuse to spend time together that had nothing to do with board meetings or stock prices or the complicated mathematics of attraction between two people from different worlds. Alexandra seemed to realize this at the same moment, her eyes finding his across the cramped room with an expression that might have been loss or relief or something more complicated than either. "This is incredible news," she said, but her voice carried a note of something that definitely wasn't celebration. "We can help millions of people without putting Cole and Lucas through constant medical procedures." The words were right. The sentiment was appropriate. But the silence that followed felt like the space between heartbeats before everything changed irrevocably. Dr. Reynolds was already talking about clinical trials and FDA approval and the pharmaceutical partnerships that would be necessary to bring the synthetic antibodies to market. But Cole found himself only half listening, too focused on the way Alexandra's smile didn't quite reach her eyes. That night, Alexandra came to the trailer park for the first time, navigating the potholed roads in her Tesla like an explorer venturing into uncharted territory. She sat at Cole's tiny kitchen table, looking impossibly elegant in the cramped space, watching him make grilled cheese sandwiches for Lucas with the fascination of someone observing an alien ritual. "This feels more like home than my penthouse ever did," she said quietly, and Cole heard genuine wonder in her voice, rather than condescension or pity. Lucas looked up from his homework, studying her with the sharp perception that 8-year-olds possessed, but adults had trained themselves to ignore. "Are you sad, Miss Alexandra?" he asked with the brutal honesty that made children such dangerous conversationalists. "You look like Dad does when he has nightmares." Out of the mouths of babes, Cole thought, seeing the truth his son had spotted immediately. Alexandra's composure cracked slightly, revealing something raw and uncertain underneath the corporate polish. "Sometimes being successful means being lonely," she replied, her honesty surprising all of them. "I spent so many years focused on building my company that I forgot to build relationships that mattered." Lucas considered this with 8-year-old seriousness, his pencil forgotten in his small hand. "But you don't have to be lonely now," he said with the simple logic of childhood. "You have us. You're part of our family." The statement hung in the air like a challenge, and Cole watched Alexandra's breath catch, as if Lucas had just offered her something she'd wanted her entire life, but never dared to ask for. "Is that an official invitation?" Alexandra asked, her voice carefully light, but her eyes bright with something that might have been tears. Lucas grinned, gap-toothed and brilliant as sunshine breaking through storm clouds. "Dad, tell her she can stay for dinner. And maybe tomorrow, too. And maybe forever if she wants." The child's words carried the weight of destiny, and Cole felt the last of his carefully constructed walls crumbling like ancient fortifications, finally surrendering to time and weather. "Well," he said, his voice rougher than usual, "I guess you're stuck with us now. Fair warning, though. Lucas snores. I burn everything I try to cook, and we're not exactly equipped for entertaining billionaire CEOs. The call came at 2:17 in the morning, dragging Cole from the first peaceful sleep he'd had in weeks. His phone buzzed with unknown urgency, the ringtone cutting through his dreams like a fire alarm. "Cole." Alexandra's voice was tight with pain and fear, each word carefully controlled but unable to hide the panic underneath. "I'm at Springfield General, emergency room. The synthetic antibodies aren't working. My body is rejecting them, treating them like foreign invaders." Fear shot through Cole like electricity, jerking him fully awake and reaching for clothes before his conscious mind had fully processed what she was telling him. "I'm coming," he said, already pulling on jeans and hunting for his keys. 20 minutes. He found her in the same emergency room where their story had begun 6 months earlier, connected to machines that beeped and hummed with electronic urgency. But this time was different in ways that went beyond medical charts and treatment protocols. This time, Cole wasn't just a stranger with the right blood type who happened to be in the right place at the right time. This time, seeing Alexandra pale and struggling felt like watching his own life slip away through his fingers, like losing something essential that he'd only just discovered he couldn't live without. The synthetic antibodies triggered a new autoimmune response. Dr. Reynolds explained grimly, his exhaustion evident in every line of his face. Her body is attacking them as foreign substances. We need natural antibodies, your antibodies, to stabilize her condition and reset her immune system. The transfusion took 4 hours this time, longer than any of the previous procedures. Cole lay on the gurney beside Alexandra's bed, their blood mingling through clear tubes while machines monitored every aspect of their vital signs with electronic vigilance. Their hands were clasped together with desperate intensity, fingers intertwined like lifelines in a storm-tossed sea. I was an idiot to think medical technology could replace human connection, Alexandra whispered when she was strong enough to speak without triggering coughing fits. Some things can't be replicated in a laboratory, no matter how sophisticated the equipment. Cole squeezed her fingers gently, feeling the warmth gradually returning to her skin like spring water flowing after a hard freeze. "Good thing I'm not planning on going anywhere," he replied, his voice carrying a promise that went far beyond medical procedures and research partnerships. "Someone has to keep you alive long enough to realize how stubborn you are." Alexandra managed a weak laugh, the sound more beautiful to Cole than any symphony he'd ever heard. "I love you," she said simply, the words falling into the space between them like seeds into fertile ground. "I know it's complicated and impossible and probably the worst timing in medical history, but I needed to say it in case something happened." Cole felt his heart stutter in his chest, not from medical trauma, but from the shock of hearing someone say the words he'd given up hoping to hear again. "I love you too," he said, and the admission felt like jumping out of an airplane without knowing if his parachute would open. "Have for months, actually. Just didn't think a janitor and a CEO had much chance of making it work." Alexandra turned her head on the pillow to look at him directly, her eyes bright with tears that had nothing to do with pain. "We're not a janitor and a CEO," she said firmly. "We're Cole and Alexandra, two people who found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and decided to build something beautiful together." The heart monitor attached to her chest beeped steadily, marking time like a metronome counting out the rhythm of their new beginning. When Alexandra was stable enough to return home, she made a decision that surprised everyone who thought they knew her, including herself. "I'm stepping down as CEO of Sterling Industries," she announced to her assistant over the phone while Cole listened from the hospital visitor's chair, still processing the events of the last 24 hours. "Effective at the end of the quarter. I'll retain my position as chairman of the board, but I want Peterson to take over daily operations." The protests from the other end of the line were audible even to Cole, a stream of corporate panic and strategic concerns that Alexandra deflected with calm determination. "This isn't about the medical issues," she continued firmly. "This is about choosing what matters most. I've spent 20 years building a company. Now I want to spend time building a life." 6 months later, they were married in Springfield's oldest church, a small ceremony that reflected their shared preference for substance over spectacle. Lucas served as ring bearer, his face serious with the importance of his role, while Dr. Reynolds walked Alexandra down the aisle in the absence of family who had long since written her off as too focused on business to care about relationships. Mrs. Henderson from the trailer park cried happy tears from the front pew, her weathered hands clutching tissues like prayer flags. Alexandra wore a simple white dress from a local boutique, no designer labels or celebrity photographers in sight, and Cole wore his dress uniform from his army days, the medals catching the afternoon light that streamed through stained glass windows, depicting biblical scenes of redemption and grace. The reception was held in the church basement, with potluck dishes contributed by neighbors and friends, and a DJ who played classic rock instead of the string quartet that would have been expected at a Sterling Industries corporate event. Alexandra danced with Lucas to Sweet Caroline, both of them laughing as the 8-year-old tried to teach her the hand movements he'd learned in elementary school music class. Cole watched from the edge of the makeshift dance floor, still amazed that this was his life, that the woman twirling his son around in circles was the same person who had once commanded boardrooms and negotiated billion-dollar deals with the ruthless efficiency of a general planning military campaigns. When the song ended, Alexandra came to him slightly breathless and glowing with happiness that transformed her entire face into something radiant. "No regrets?" she asked, their traditional question that had become a touchstone in their relationship. "About marrying a woman who needs your blood to stay alive?" Cole pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo mixed with the lingering antiseptic from her most recent hospital stay. "My blood was poison until it saved you," he said quietly, the words carrying the weight of 15 years of guilt and self-doubt, finally transformed into purpose. "Now it's the thing that keeps us connected forever, the proof that broken things can still save each other." Alexandra tilted her head back to look at him, her eyes bright with tears that had everything to do with joy and nothing to do with sadness. 2 years after their wedding, the Brennan Medical Research Foundation opened its first official clinic in downtown Springfield, housed in a converted storefront between a used bookstore and a family restaurant that had been serving the same menu since 1973. It wasn't much to look at from the outside. Simple glass windows and a hand-painted sign that Lucas had helped design. But it represented something revolutionary in the treatment of autoimmune diseases. Children from across the Midwest came to receive treatments derived from Cole's unique blood chemistry, their families no longer facing impossible choices between medical bills and mortgage payments. Lucas, now 10 years old and increasingly interested in the science behind his father's genetic gift, volunteered on weekends, explaining to younger patients what it felt like to have different blood and why different wasn't something to be ashamed of. Alexandra found her calling in patient advocacy, using her business skills to navigate insurance bureaucracies and pharmaceutical politics with the same strategic thinking she'd once applied to hostile takeovers. She was happier than she'd ever been as a CEO, working 16-hour days for causes that saved lives instead of maximizing profit margins. "You know what's funny?" she told Cole one evening as they walked through downtown Springfield, Lucas running ahead to feed ducks at the small park near the courthouse. "I spent 20 years building an empire that impressed everyone and satisfied no one, especially me. But this little clinic that most people have never heard of, this feels like the most important thing I've ever done." The foundation expanded slowly but steadily over the following years as other veterans with Gulf War syndrome came forward, some carrying similar genetic adaptations that could treat different autoimmune conditions. The research network grew to include facilities in 8 states, all connected by the thread of Cole's original sacrifice and Alexandra's determination to turn personal trauma into universal healing. Dr. Reynolds often joked that he'd witnessed the medical miracle of the century, but privately he believed the real miracle was watching 2 broken people create something beautiful together, something that would outlast their individual lives and touch generations they would never meet. On Lucas's 12th birthday, they received a package from halfway around the world, drawings and letters from children in 6 different countries whose autoimmune diseases had gone into remission after receiving treatments based on Cole's blood chemistry. Maria Santos from Mexico had drawn her family holding hands under a rainbow, with Gracias Coli Alexandra written in careful cursive at the bottom. Tommy Chen from Vancouver had sent a photo of himself playing soccer, his juvenile arthritis no longer limiting his dreams of athletic glory. Sarah Mackenzie from Dublin had written a poem about heroes who didn't wear capes but gave blood instead. Lucas pinned each piece of mail to his bedroom wall, creating a gallery of gratitude that served as daily reminder of why their family's unusual story mattered. That night, as they tucked Lucas into bed, surrounded by his collection of patient artwork and thank you notes, he asked the question that had been building in his young mind for months. "Mom, Dad, do you think I'll help sick kids when I grow up too?" Cole and Alexandra exchanged glances over their son's head, seeing in each other's eyes the same mixture of pride and protective concern that all parents felt when their children began to understand their place in the larger world. "What do you think, buddy?" Alexandra asked gently, settling into the chair beside his bed that had become her traditional spot for bedtime conversations. Lucas considered this with the seriousness he brought to all important matters, his dark eyes thoughtful in the lamplight. "I think maybe that's why God made our blood different," he said finally, his words carrying the simple wisdom that children sometimes possessed. "So we could help people who hurt, like Dad helped you, and you helped Dad, and now we all help other families together." Cole felt his throat tighten with emotion, pride and love, and hope all tangled together in a knot that made breathing difficult. His son, this brilliant, compassionate boy who had never known a world where his genetic differences were shameful, had found purpose in the very thing that had once made Cole feel cursed and isolated. "I think you're absolutely right," Cole said quietly, his voice rough with feelings too large for words. "Sometimes the things that make us different are exactly what the world needs most." Later that evening, as Cole and Alexandra sat on their front porch swing, watching fireflies dance in the summer darkness, she leaned against his shoulder with the comfortable weight of shared history and intertwined futures. "Any regrets?" she asked, their traditional question that had evolved from a nervous habit into a celebration of choices well made. Cole thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment, the chemical fire that had poisoned his blood in Fallujah, the autoimmune disease that had nearly killed her in Springfield General, the son who carried hope in his veins, the love that had grown from medical necessity into something unshakable and eternal. "Just one," he said finally, feeling Alexandra raise her head to look at him with eyebrows raised in question. "I regret that it took so long for our paths to cross. Think of all the good we could have done together if we'd met sooner, all the years we lost before we found each other." Alexandra smiled, the expression transforming her face into something radiant in the porch light. "Then let's not waste any more time," she said, her voice carrying the determination that had built empires and saved lives. "We have a lot of people to help, a lot of children to heal, and a whole lifetime to figure out how to do it together." In the distance, the Springfield Courthouse clock tower chimed midnight, marking the beginning of another day in their extraordinary, ordinary life. The story of Cole Brennan and Alexandra Sterling had become legend in their small city and beyond. The janitor whose poisoned blood became medicine, the CEO who chose love over profit, the child who carried the future in his veins. But to the 3 people living it, sitting together on a porch swing in a middle-class neighborhood where children rode bicycles and neighbors knew each other's names, it was simply Tuesday night becoming Wednesday morning, another opportunity to plan tomorrow's small miracles and count themselves fortunate to have found each other in a world that seemed designed to keep broken people apart. Sometimes salvation comes through suffering, Sometimes healing requires bleeding first, and sometimes the rarest gift comes packaged in the most unlikely vessel, waiting for the right moment and the right person to unlock its potential to change everything.